Daniel chapter 2 tonight. Daniel chapter number 2 as we continue. We started out with just wanting to really hit on the matter of developing Daniels and giving you some philosophy behind why we're doing what we do with our young people, whether it be the school or even the music ministry. And then we spent two messages, I think, in Daniel chapter 1. And so I thought we'll just keep going. Let's just go through the book of Daniel. Now, Daniel is to the Old Testament what Revelation is to the New Testament. And in fact, I don't think you can really understand the book of Revelation if you do not know something about the book of Daniel and vice versa. In fact, when I took it in Bible college, took it from Dr. Childs, it was a class called Daniel and Revelation. And they were together, and it was helped to see how God orchestrated that and put those together. So we took a couple weeks examining the information in chapter number 1, and we saw how Daniel and his 3 friends were taken captive away into Babylon, and Babylon would be modern-day Iraq, and Nebuchadnezzar's the king at that particular time, and one of the most ruthless and cruel kings and men with no accountability whatsoever, except we're going to see that there's one that was greater than King Nebuchadnezzar. And now we're moving into this second chapter. And Brother Cherry's going to attempt and just play with putting verses up on the screen that could maybe be a help. And as we try some of these things, I walked in and saw the pictures of graduation, and I was just very thankful to have a nice, crisp projector and screen. It just looks nice. I hope you see the same quality sitting out where you're sitting, and it's a real blessing. I thank the Lord for that. I can tell, looking at some of you, are not really that thrilled with it, and I can tell the ones who are used to going to the movie theaters and you see bigger and better screens. Well, God can blind you, and that's why some of you are struggling with your eyesight. And so just, but I'm going to brag on the Lord and thank the Lord anyway, even if you pooch your lip out there and haven't even gotten into the message yet, and already you're looking bad. And so, well, it's a Wednesday night, but that's no excuse. But we're moving into chapter number 2. I'm not going to have you stand. We're going to work our way through this in chapter number 2. I hope you'll take some notes, and maybe what I can do is I can put together a sheet of information over the survey of the book to give you a better idea. But until I do that, just pay attention, and maybe we'll incorporate Dr. Childs. We get a little bit further into this and get into some of the prophecy aspect of it. But we get into chapter 2, and it seems to change gears a little bit, and it's a very interesting chapter, and it's broken up in basically 5 different parts here. But we see 3 major characters that we're going to look at in the message this evening. One is King Nebuchadnezzar. We've already mentioned him. He's the king of the mightiest empire in the entire world at this particular time. And what we're going to see is that God is revealing to King Nebuchadnezzar in a dream, a major prophecy about the future. It's a prophecy we're going to get into, and we're going to study not tonight, but we're going to get into this. And the verses leading up to that interpretation of the dream, what really is the substance of the message this evening. For those who are familiar with chapter 2, there are some that all they think of when they think of chapter number 2 is the 10 toes. And I'm going to disappoint you, but the 10 toes ain't what you think the 10 toes are about. I think I've heard more preaching on the 10 toes here. And so if you're part of the tribe of the 10 toes, you may be disappointed at my take on this as we go through it. But I hope you'll see the Bible's take on the 10 toes and come away and get something out of it that'll be life-changing. And so not only is King Nebuchadnezzar one of those characters, and for those of you who don't have any idea what I'm talking about with the 10 toes, you actually have a benefit. And you don't have to try to reprogram some of the things you may have listened to and heard on TV and picked up by Joyce Myers or something like that. And you really have a clean slate, and you'll be helped. But then not only King Nebuchadnezzar, but we see Daniel and his 3 friends. They're being carried over from chapter number 1. Now, they've already completed their 3-year crash course, and they're now advisors to the king. They've grown into this role of giving expert advice to the king. But the major character is not King Nebuchadnezzar. It's not Daniel and his 3 friends. The major hero and character in chapter number 2 is the Lord God. And as we read this chapter, we're going to see the God of Israel, who is in complete control of every situation. He's accomplishing His purposes even through superstitious Gentile unbelievers. And I just got a lot of encouragement from that. As we look at our landscape tonight, what is going on all around us? It's easy sometimes to think we are outnumbered, and we are. We are outpowered, humanly we are. We're outmanned, and humanly we are. But God is working in a tremendous miracle kind of way through superstitious Gentile heathen unbelievers. Now, I mentioned 5 parts. If you want to jot this down and look at chapter 2 this way, the first part is the king gets agitated. He's bothered. We're going to see that it has to do with his dream. He's bothered. Number 2, Daniel gets involved. Number 3, a dream gets interpreted. Number 4, the king, we'll see later on, he gets religious. And then number 5, Daniel gets promoted. That's just the basic working down through here. But as I mentioned, the hero, the emphasis is about God. Verse 22, Daniel states, and as he talks to God, verse 22, he revealeth the deep and secret things. That's in private. And then in public, we're going to see this, verse 28. Now notice this. Verse 28, Daniel declares, but there is a God in heaven. And that's what I want to preach on tonight. There is a God in heaven. And as we talk about this God who is in heaven tonight, I want us to see how He orchestrates His activities, how He protects His servants, how He brings glory to His name. And so we're going to look at some basic components here. First of all, we'll start with the king's dream. We're talking about tonight the God who is in heaven, and He's working through this dream that He gives this mighty, powerful pagan king. In verse number 1 of chapter 2, and in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Now, we're told Nebuchadnezzar's in his 2nd year of his reign, and is mentioned more than anybody else, any other ruler in the Old Testament. But he's a very wicked, he's a godless man, but God has a purpose for Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar thought what he was doing was building an empire for himself, but actually what is happening, and I think if you will take some of these things and think about what's going on today and around the world. Nebuchadnezzar thought he was building an empire for himself, but actually what is truly happening is God is doing something with Nebuchadnezzar, and that God is building a schoolhouse for His children. He's going to use Nebuchadnezzar to equip his men. See, Nebuchadnezzar, the strongest and most powerful man, everybody answers to him. He's got this agenda. I'm building the greatest empire in all of the earth. But actually, God is using Nebuchadnezzar to be an equipping station for His people. Israel would be carried into captivity, as we've seen, and during their days in captivity in Babylon, God's going to teach the Israelites some very important lessons. And it has to do with this dream. You remember Abraham Lincoln, on April 14th, 1865, he met with his cabinet in Washington. And they're waiting for a report from the campaign of General Sherman, who was pressing the cause of the Union forces in the South. And as they were waiting for the report, Abraham Lincoln shared with his cabinet that he had been having this reoccurring dream. It seemed that this dream would always come before some major event in the war. He said that his dream was a dream about an indescribable vessel that was moving rapidly toward an indefinite destination. And he wondered what the meaning of that dream was. And we know that evening, same evening, he was mortally wounded by John Wilkes Booth before the day had expired. And Abraham Lincoln's life's vessel was moved to the shores of eternity. You know, he had a reoccurring dream that had a tremendous impact upon him personally and also upon the nation and upon eternity. In chapter number 2, Nebuchadnezzar too has a dream that has great impact upon him, upon a nation, and also upon eternity, even in a greater way. Nebuchadnezzar, he's concerned about his future, as we all are. Nebuchadnezzar's wondering what's ahead. He's a leader. He has the weight of the entire nation upon himself. And he's so often weary, he's not able to sleep at night. And maybe some of you too worry about your future. I know there are still people that are concerned and consumed with COVID-19, so much so that it affects their thinking of the future. It affects their sleep. You're wondering about the future of your family. You're wondering about the future of your children. You're wondering about your own health, welfare. When we look at the world conditions around us, we have some cause for some concern. I remember reading about a father who went to the store looking for a toy for his child. And the toy store worker said, well, here's an educational toy that would be good for your children. It's a toy that they can never put together. It's a toy that will prepare your child for the world in which they live. Doesn't that describe it? But Nebuchadnezzar, he's having this reoccurring dream. He's wondering what is going on around him. What is the future to behold? And verse 1 says that his sleep brake from him. That just means he could not sleep. It says his spirit was troubled. Literally, it means his spirit smote him. And he's in this atmosphere of this dream. He can't remember the details of the dream. Verse number 2 says, then the king commanded to call, notice, the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And so there's a list of people he calls. Who are the magicians? Well, that literally means that they were to write with a stylus. These were evidently the writing scholars, those who would prepare the papers. The astrologers, those were the ones who studied the movements of the heavens, thinking that destiny would be determined in the stars. And then the sorcerers, those are the ones who had a contact with the occult. And then the Chaldeans, these are said to be the philosophers of the time. In other words, this would be the king's personal think tank. And these were the ones that the king would turn to for advice. So he brings them in. But the end of verse 2 says, so they came and stood before the king. Do you see them as they're marching in? The most brilliant men. They're coming in to talk about this dream. It's an important situation. They're coming in with their PhDs and their degrees, all their expertise. They come walking into the palace where the king is. Notice verse 3. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. He is saying that he doesn't know the interpretation of the dream. And so, first of all, we had the king's dream. But then let's go to the second aspect tonight, and that is, as we go through this movement, beginning in verse 4, I want us to see these wise men's dilemma, the wise men's dilemma. Notice in verse 4, then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream and we will show the interpretation. Notice the phrase, then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac. That means they spoke to him in Aramaic. Now something happens here in this book of Daniel, which is not apparent reading in our English, but from this point in the book of Daniel, it is written not in the Hebrew language, but in Aramaic. So from Daniel chapter 2 and verse 4, going through chapter 7 and verse 28, it's written in Aramaic, whereas the bulk of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, bulk of the New Testament is written in Greek. But here we have a section where they change their language and they begin to speak to him in Aramaic. And it's a very unusual change. It's a very unusual dynamic. But God is getting ready to reveal the future to the Gentile nations. So in the language of the Gentile nations, God is going to give this revelation. It's still, to me, it's incredibly astounding. God is entrusting an incredible revelation that is impacting all of future and history and eternity, and he's going to entrust it, giving it to pagans. The fact is, there's a God in heaven. He's up to something all the time. So, verse number 4, then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac. In verse number 4, they say, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. They're saying, you tell us, we'll show you. You remember in kindergarten, I think Miss Andrea has in her class, or did last year, show and tell. The kids would bring something to show and tell. Well, this is the advanced version of the game. These experts, they don't have the foggiest idea. And so what they're saying is, you show us, we'll tell you what it is. You know, that's just like it is when you go to the doctor. Anyone ever experienced that? The doctor said, well, what's wrong? And I tell him. Then he shows me what's wrong. I remember hearing about another young doctor on his first day of practice, and the first patient came in. He examined the patient, didn't have a clue what was happening, but he didn't want to admit it. He just didn't have the nerve to admit, I don't know what's wrong. So he asked the patient, have you ever had this before? And the patient said, well, yes, I have. So the doctor said, well, I confirm you have it again. That was the end of it. And so that's about the way these guys were. They don't know. They don't know what's going on. And so they say in verse number 4, you tell, we will show. Notice verse 5. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. He is saying, he doesn't remember the details of the dream. And so now what he does is he sets up a system. I call it a game. It's not so much a game because this is life and death. But he sets up a system of penalties and rewards. He says in verse number 5, this thing is gone from me. I can't remember the details. If ye will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces. And your houses shall be made a dunghill. But if you show the dream and the interpretation thereof, ye shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. So he sets up this system of motivation dealing with penalties and rewards. He gives the negative first. The negative is, I'm going to kill you. If you don't come up with the answer, I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to take your house and turn it into a garbage heap. But the positive is, I'll let you live, and then I'll reward you with gifts and rewards and honor. So on, he sets up this system of penalties and rewards. And the king is getting a little bit hot, I believe. And Nebuchadnezzar, as we will find out later on, he does have some mental problems. And he becomes crazy before the book of Daniel's over. And all that's fascinating. But I think he can be a pretty edgy kind of a guy. In verse number 8, the king answered and said, I know of certainty that ye would gain the time because ye see this thing is gone from me. He's saying, you're stalling for time. You don't know. Because you see the thing is, you see that I don't have the details. All y'all are doing is stalling for time. And that's what they were saying in verse 6 and 7. But if you show the dream and the interpretation, and they answered again, said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. He just said, you're stalling. Verse number 9. But if ye will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. For ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me till the time be changed. And he charges them with being a bunch of frauds. He's saying that they evidently don't know the answer. Verse number 10, the Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there's not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. Do you see their arrogance? These are experts, and they're saying what some of the experts today basically think, and that is, if we don't know the answers, nobody knows the answer. You know, if those of us elected to a public political office, if we don't know the answer, y'all don't know the answer. And that's the way they're putting this. But there is a group of people on this earth who do know the answer. There are some people on this earth who understand that there are some truths that can only be revealed by God, the God in heaven, and that God hides these things from the wise and the prudent at times. Jesus said that in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 25, but he reveals them unto babes. You know what that tells me? It tells me that sometimes it can be the janitor sweeping the steps that lead to the university classroom that may have more answers about the real meaning of life than the so-called learned scholars who climb those steps and teach in those classrooms. Some of those basic questions of life in our institutions of higher learning, they cannot even answer, such as, who am I? Where did I come from? And where am I going? Yet most everyone in this room can answer those very basic, elementary, fundamental questions of life. Who am I? You're God's creation. Amen. You are creation of God Himself. Where did you come from? God made you. Where are you going? You're going for eternity. You'll live as long as God lives. But these are arrogant men. And these arrogant men say there's not an answer. There's not an answer to this problem. You and I know something that they didn't know. There is a man who knows. There was a young man who knew the answers, and his name was Daniel. Notice in verse number 12. For this cause the king was angry and very furious and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. Evidently, Daniel and his friends didn't know what was going on at this particular time. They were not included. But here's a crisis. Now there's a major crisis. It goes from a major crisis of the top man on the earth who has a problem. No one can help him. The top scholars and cabinet officials can't help them. And so the major crisis gets to be even a greater crisis. The king says, out with all of you. Into oblivion, every one of you. And so the word goes out from the king that these experts, the advisors, are to be killed. In verse number 14, it brings us to verse 14. Then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. And that leads us to this final section tonight. We see the declaration that Daniel's going to make. And this is in verse 14 through verse number 28. In verse number 15, he answered and said to the captain of the guard, why is the decree so hasty from the king? Then the king's captain, Arioch, made this thing known to Daniel, verse 16. Then Daniel went in, desired of the king that he would give him time and that he would show the king the interpretation. Evidently, Daniel was well thought of by King Nebuchadnezzar. Remember in chapter 1, after their 3-year crash course of training, Daniel and his friends, they became better equipped by their loyalty to God, and they had great favor before the king. And we're told that in chapter 1, verse 17. But God gives Daniel the ability to understand and to interpret dreams. And God was speaking to Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan ruler, by means of a dream. And so Daniel's just simply saying, give me a little bit of time. Give me some time to work on this, and I will interpret the meaning of the dream. Now notice in verse 17, then Daniel went to his house, and he made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, his companions, that they, verse 18, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. You see what he's saying in verse 18? What is Daniel's desire? Daniel's desire is the mercies of heaven. There's a crisis. There's a problem. I want to say tonight, there's a crisis in our land. There might be a crisis in your home. Might be a crisis in your life. You ought to desire, I ought to desire what Daniel and his companions are desiring. That is the mercies of heaven. And they're going to ask God the meaning of this dream. He is saying, we're going to pray about it. We're going to pray about this. And that's what exactly he is doing. We're going to pray. You know, God's given us a wonderful promise in James chapter 1 and verse 5. And if you've not memorized James 1 and verse 5, I encourage you to do so. Where God promises that if any one of us lacks wisdom, that we can ask of God. And the Bible says God gives to all men liberally that answer, that promise of wisdom, and upbraideth not. Means he doesn't get on to you. He doesn't chew you out. He doesn't belittle you. And he's not bothered with you asking. God says, if you need wisdom, ask me. I will give it to you. What a wonderful promise. And so Daniel's going to God in prayer. He says, we're going to desire the mercies of heaven, and he gathers his friend together. That's why I say we have to maintain the emphasis and priority of corporate prayer meetings. You have a decision that needs to be made. It's a good thing for you to get other people to pray with you. But I'd be careful too, and not just getting people together just so you can share your burden. There's nothing wrong with sharing your burden, but don't confuse sharing your burden to be the same as praying. Because sometimes you're collecting people to pray with you, and they're not in step with God. They're not in tune with God. And it's good to communicate. Daniel communicates with his friends. But I want to tell you, these 4 men, they were in tune with heaven. And it makes a difference. It's not just sharing my burden. I think there is more talk that is done in giving prayer requests than many times in talking to the one who is the only one who can answer the prayer request. And so please understand, there needs to be, if we're going to have that horizontal dimension of communicating to others, let's make sure that our primary focus is vertical on getting to God. That's one of the great blessings of coming together on Wednesday nights where we can have our corporate prayer meetings. That's one of the things I'm thankful Brother Matthew is leading the prayer charge on Sunday nights, because there needs to be the corporate emphasis. That's why I'm thankful we've got the men meeting again Sunday morning, because we need the corporate time of prayer, and we need other times as well. One of the great privileges, which is mine, is to be able to pray for the congregation. One of the great privileges, which is mine, is to, as your pastors, to ask you to pray for me. And that's what Daniel is doing. We have decisions that need to be made. We have plans that need to be mapped out. We need the wisdom of God. So Daniel gets his friends together and they begin to pray. Now notice verse 19. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel, in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. We don't know exactly how it came about, but it says the secret was revealed unto Daniel in that night vision. That means that God revealed it. That means that God just shows him what the dream was all about. Now, I would think if it were me in this, I'd get that answer. I'm jetting out of bed. I'm hightailing it over to King Nebuchadnezzar, and I'm communicating this not because of lives that are at stake, but for me it'd be, this is a big deal. No one else could get the answer. God gave the answer. But do you see what happens? He didn't rush back into the presence of King Nebuchadnezzar. Instead, notice what he does. Notice in verse number 20. We have that up there. Verse number 20. I'm going to take a sip here. Notice what he does. Verse 20. But Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. Do you see what he does? Notice in verse 21, and he changeth the times and the season. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. Anybody getting what he's doing here? Anybody picking up on it? Notice still verse 22. Do you see what he's doing? He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. Who's he talking to? He's talking to God. Do you see what he's doing? Look at it in verse 23. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who has given me wisdom and might, and has made known unto me now what we desired of thee, for thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. Do you see what he's doing? Well, let's recap what he did. Crisis. What does Daniel do? Get his three companions together. Listen, when there's a trial, you need your praying tribe. And he gets them together, and what do they do? What did they do? They prayed. And what does God do? He answered their prayer. So now what is he doing? He's thanking God for answers to prayer. He's praising God. Let me ask you, when was the last time you praised God for answered prayer? Praising without praying, thanking without asking is presumption. But praying and not praising is ingratitude. When God answers prayer, we need to thank him for it. In verse number 24, therefore, Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went in and said thus unto him, destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show unto you the king the interpretation. Now Daniel's ready. In verse 25, then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste and said thus unto him. I have a feeling that Arioch is more anxious than Daniel was. And he comes in and he says, I have found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation. The truth is, he didn't find Daniel. And he's taking a little bit of credit there. Hey, when your life's at stake, there's all kinds of things that are probably going to come out of your mouth. The king answered, verse 26, and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen and the interpretation thereof? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king? But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. You know, Daniel doesn't take a bit of credit. Daniel doesn't say, in all my years of training. Daniel doesn't say, well, my experience. Daniel points the king to the high king of heaven. He says there is a God in heaven. He's really there. He really does exist. There is a God in heaven. Hey, if you have a problem tonight, there's a God in heaven who has the answer to your problem some thousands of years later. Do you have a need tonight? Do you have any kind of a need? Well, there's a God in heaven who can meet that need. We need to turn to God. We need to lift our hearts to God. We need to request mercy from God. And we need to come and bring our prayer tribe in a time of testing and tribulation. And we need to wait for the presence of the Lord to make known the answer and then to be thankful for that which He does. He says, there's a God in heaven. Well, that's really the message we're getting to. So hold on, let me give you a few points here about this God of heaven. There's a God in heaven tonight who is sovereign in the lives of men and nations. The thing which impresses me the most as I read through this book of Daniel is that God is high over all. He is all powerful, and He's active. And He has the last word in the affairs of men, nations, and in the lives of His own children. That encourages me. Because I get caught up looking at some of this political stuff. And I see exactly what some of you see. And you see there's a lot of crooks. And there are people who are unapologetic even about being dishonest, about being crooks. But I want you to know there's a God in heaven who's sovereign. Psalm 115 verse 3, you might want to write it down. But our God is in the heavens. He hath done whatsoever He hath pleased. See, God's ways are behind the scenes. But do you know that He moves all the scenes which He is behind? See, we sometimes think, well, He's just far out there. He's unremoved. No, He may be behind the scenes, but He's moving all the scenes. We have to learn this and let God work and not worry so much about man's busy movements. Man will accomplish God's plan. And those that do not, they're going to disappear. Because God is on the throne. One of the most comforting truths to us is the one we know, Romans 8:28. Number one, there's a God in heaven who is sovereign in the lives of men and of nations. Number two, the God who is in heaven is a God who reveals Himself and His ways to those who seek Him and serve Him. Oh, He's a God who's on the throne. He is the greatest, the mightiest, the all-powerful one. But He reveals Himself to each and every one that will seek Him. This is a truth illustrated in the experience of Daniel and his friends. Look over in chapter 1, verse 17. As for the 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Notice back over chapter 2 and verse number 16. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time and that he would show the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah's companions, that they would desire mercies of God, of the God of heaven, concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Notice again verse 22. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with them. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who has given me wisdom and might, and has made known unto me now what we desired of thee. For thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. Notice in verse 27 again. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream, thy visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. Oh God, he longs to reveal himself to those and his ways, not just himself, but his ways of those who will seek and serve him. We see it over and over and over again. Number 3, there is a God in heaven. And this God in heaven is a God who hears and answers the prayers of those who call upon him. Hey, anyone who wants some practical instruction on praying, you ought to dive into the book of Daniel. Because what you'll find in the book of Daniel is the power of prayer. What you'll find in the book of Daniel is the possibilities of prayer. What you'll find in the book of Daniel is a good procedure on prayer. This book of Daniel is an inspired treasury on prayer. It's full of illustrations of what prayer can do and God's willingness to hear and answer the prayers of the people. Just think with me about this, what you already know. Chapter number 1, we read about Daniel's great testing and his firm resolve. He's not going to defile himself so he could stay true to God. What did Daniel do? He prayed. And what did God do? He answered his prayer. In chapter number 2, we just read about the king's dream and his request to Daniel, tell me the contents, the interpretation. So what did Daniel do? Well, he did what? He prayed. Y'all catching on kind of slow here, and it's not time to pack up. I'm giving you the open book exam. I've already given you the answers, all right? Chapter 2, Daniel prayed, and then what did God do? God answered his prayer. We're going to go into a chapter we've not covered, but you should get the gist at this point. We read about the friends in the fiery furnace. And so what do? You want to guess what they did? They prayed. You can read about it again later. And what does God do? He answered their prayer. Chapters 4 and 5, we read more about some praying. We read more about some answers. Chapter 6, Daniel's cast into the lion's den. And by the way, what is he cast into the lion's den for? For praying. He's cast into the lion's den, the den of lions, and what does he do? He still prays. And what does God do? I'm telling you, you want to learn about prayer, get into the book of Daniel. Our God is a God who delights to hear and answer the prayers of his people. Jeremiah 33:3, say it with me. Call unto me, and I will answer thee, and show thee great and mighty things which thou knowest not. Well, let me give you another thought here. Number 4. Number 4. The God, our God who is in heaven, is a God who always honors those who seek to honor him. 1 Samuel 2 and verse 30. God says, them that honor me, I will honor. That's why we try to honor those who are honoring God, because you get what you honor. You get what you honor. I think a lot of times I've seen over the years in Christian schools where they would honor the athlete who is not serving God, doesn't have a heart for God. I remember one particular school where I was, they were recognizing in chapel where I was preaching the revival, a young man who got the most talented. It wasn't the most talented. It was whatever their mascot was. It was that thing. It was the most valuable player. And the thing is, the youth pastor told me about this athlete. He could dunk a ball, but he said they were always having to get on to him while he's on the court because he would let a curse word slip out. I said, not only is he not your most valuable player, you should have kicked him out. You know, the problem with that is not just the young man's heart that's black and dark and ugly and sinful. It's the terrible leadership who are not leading. You get what you honor. And everyone else who hears him let a 4-letter word fly, but he can dunk a basketball. What do you think it teaches them? Well, that the athletics is more important than the spiritual. It doesn't matter whether it's athletics. It could be academics. Or they're the salutatorian. I was in another Christian school preaching revival, a school of 500 in the junior high and senior high alone. The valedictorian. The valedictorian was a Jehovah's Witness in this Christian school. 500 in the student body. And yet I asked, how many have gone to Bible college in the last 4 years? They could come up with only 7 people that had gone off to Bible college. I want to tell you, the problem is they were getting what they were honoring. But I want to tell you, the God who is in heaven is a God who will always honor those who seek to honor him. In chapter 1, when Daniel sought to honor God, you know what God did? God honored him. In chapter number 2, as Daniel and his friends sought to honor the Lord honors them. In chapter number 3, we're going to see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They seek to honor the Lord. And guess what the Lord's going to do? I'm going to start all over again if you don't get with this. The Lord honors them. I'm trying to give you the answers. I can tell we don't have the brightest bulbs in the drawer here, do we? In chapter number 6, as Daniel seeks to honor his Lord, the God of heaven will honor him. The fact is, Matthew 6:33 is still true. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Let me give you the last thought about our God who is in heaven. The God who is in heaven tonight is a God who will sustain his people in times of fierce trial and testing. Daniel's long life was filled with terrific testing. God did not exempt him from going through trials and tests. But what God did was he sustained him and his friends through every trial and test. Would you please understand, when you enter into a measure of revival, you take a step of faith, God has to give you a test. God did it with his nation of Israel, and God does it with his church, and God does it with individuals. If your faith is not tested, your faith cannot be made true. And so you have to experience that. But God has promised to sustain. What does the Lord, the God of heaven, give his children during great times of testing? Well, he gives you a few things. Number one, his presence. In Daniel chapter 3, we're going to get there. We're going to see the presence of the Lord is what makes the difference. Hebrews 13, verse 5, he says, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear what man shall do unto me. Not only does he give you his presence in great times of trial and testing, but also his protection. We'll see that in chapter 6. Remember Daniel in the den of lions. Actual lions that are there. What did God do? He protected them. You know, somebody asked, do you believe that God uses angels to protect? Well, I most certainly believe it because the Bible says it. But even if we don't have angels on board protecting us, God does a good job protecting. So however he sees fit. Not only does he give his presence, his protection, but also his peace. The Lord never promises us deliverance from trouble, but he always guarantees peace in the midst of trouble. Isaiah 26, verse 3 and 4. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee. Trust ye in the Lord forever, for in the Lord Jehovah is everlasting strength. Can I remind you tonight, there's still a God in heaven. He's great. He's holy. He's a loving God. In tonight's message, we only caught a glimpse of that great God. We have said little about his holiness. We've said little about his mercy and his saving grace, and his glorious Son and his precious Holy Spirit. We've just caught a glimpse of him tonight. But as we conclude, I do want to ask you this question. Is this God of heaven, is he your God? Remember John 20 and verse 28, Thomas answered and said unto him, My Lord and my God. Have you yielded your life totally to Him? He may be your Savior, but is that Savior your guiding shepherd? Are you listening? Are you following? Are you willing to say, oh God, give me wisdom to know your will, and whatsoever your will is for my life, I'm willing to do it? See, if you want to know the will of God, listen, if you want to know the will of God, you have to be willing to do the will of God. When someone says to me, extended period of time, after extended period of time, I just don't know the will of God. I just don't know the will of God. I just don't know the will of God. That is a good tip-off. It's because you're not willing to do the will of God. See, we think of the will of God sometimes like a buffet. It's just put out there and we just take whatever. Let me give you, and I'm closing with this. Jesus said it this way in John 7 and verse 17. If any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak of myself. Listen to it again. If any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak of myself. Let me ask you this question. You got to think a little bit longer. Which comes first? The knowing God's will or your being willing to do God's will? Based upon this and the remainder of the Bible, being willing to do God's will comes first. Then knowing God's will comes next. Would you stand with me, please?